It is one of the cardinal rules of journalism. Don't get personally involved in the story. But that's exactly what Boston Globe columnist Kevin Cullen did while reporting on the story of a terminally ill woman who traveled to Vermont to die by medically assisted suicide. The woman, Lynda Bluestein, needed two people to attest that she was in a clear state of mind as she made her decision, and Cullen agreed to be one of them. In an editor's note, the Globe said the decision violated the paper's standards, but, quote, did not meaningfully impact the outcome of this story. So, did they make the right call in publishing it anyway, particularly since there is a renewed push to legalize medical aid in dying here in Massachusetts? I'm joined by Kelly McBride, Senior Vice President and Chair of the Craig Newmark Center for Ethics and Leadership at the Poynter Institute, and the Public Editor for National Public Radio, and journalist Susie Banikarim, host of the podcast In Retrospect with Susie Banikarim and Jessica Bennett, which just launched its second season. Thank you both for being here. Kelly, let me begin with you. What is your take on the appropriateness or lack thereof of Kevin Cullen attesting that Lynda Bluestein was in a clear state of mind and not operating under any duress as she made her decision to take her own life?
At the point that he did that he signed that paper, which was about 6 months before she actually ended her life, he put himself in a really horrible set of conflicting loyalties, because he had a loyalty to his story and to see his story go forward. And then he also had a loyalty to observe her journey, because the thing that makes it so interesting in following someone as they make those final decisions is it's really hard, it's complicated, and they face all sorts of emotional turmoil, family issues. And at the point that he did that he signed that paper, he basically was rooting for his story to go forward, as opposed to being attached to simply observing what happened. And I think he would have had a much better story. It would have been much more interesting to watch as she figured this out. She certainly was capable, the woman who was the subject of his story. She sued the state to be allowed to pursue this avenue for herself. So she obviously had the wherewithal to find other people to sign that paper. So I find it baffling that he made that choice.
Susie, what's your take on this question?
I agree with Kelly. I mean, listen, there are times when you become too close to a subject, but that's generally a rookie mistake. And this is not a rookie. This is not like someone at the beginning of their career. This is someone who should have known better. And I think one thing that really struck me in the story is that right before he mentioned that he had signed this letter, he told the story of another patient who had really struggled to find someone to sign their paper. And to me, he materially changed the outcome of the story. If the purpose of the story was to educate other people who might want to pursue this avenue, he skipped a step essentially by being the person who signed this and not having other, things that she would have had to do to get to the point where she ended up. So I agree. I think from an ethical perspective, it's absolutely not the right decision. It's not that you can never do something if you're in a life or death situation and you have to intervene. There are occasional times when those kind of ethical breaches make sense. But in this particular case, it just felt like something he should have known better than to do.
I want to ask each of you, Susie, then you, Kelly, does it make any difference that he is described by the Globe as both a reporter and a columnist, which are two roles that we tend to think of as at least a little bit different? If we think of him taking this step while wearing his columnist hat as opposed to his reporter hat, does it look any better? Susie, you first, and then Kelly.
I mean, I guess it's an interesting question, because if he was an opinion writer, maybe it would be slightly different. If this was a piece of advocacy where it was clear that he was advocating for this position, maybe there would have been slightly more argument that it wasn't such a breach. But in fact, in this case, they put an editor's note on the story and they said themselves that it violated their standards. So they didn't feel like there was a difference between being a reporter or a columnist in this case. And I feel like we should take the Globe at their word that this was an ethical breach. And this wasn't the first time Kevin Cullen had had an ethical breach, right? This is the second time. Previously, he was suspended for some embellishment during his Boston Marathon bombing reporting. So I think the other thing that struck me in this story as odd is that there don't seem to have been any additional consequences for Kevin. They just attached this note.
Hold that consequences thought, because that's where I want us to wrap up the convo. Kelly McBride, is it in any way exculpatory that Kevin Cullen is both a columnist and a reporter as described by his employer?
Not in this particular case, no. If he had been doing a story about a friend of his who was going through this process and he was completely transparent that he had a personal relationship with this person, that would have been a very different story and very interesting, right? I don't think that that would have been any less valuable than this particular story. But in this case, this woman made herself part of the public conversation by filing a lawsuit so that she could have the ability to take her own life in Vermont when she was not a resident of that state. And she won that lawsuit. And that was how the media became aware of her. Mm-hmm. And so he came in as an outsider. And there is also value in that sort of distant observation and just watching somebody as they walk through a very difficult and intimate process. And so, I mean, I agree it's a rookie mistake. And I also think that one of the things that some columnists have trouble doing is figuring out when they really are part of the story and when they're not part of the story. Because just because you're an opinion columnist doesn't mean that you are a central character in every story. And in this case, and his previous ethical breach as well, he kept making himself a central character of the story, unnecessarily so, right? And that, I think, is also problematic.
We should probably, I wanted to get to his suspension back in 2018, I believe 3 months without pay for fabricating details about what he experienced in connection to the Boston Marathon bombings, not in his work at the Globe, but in public appearances in other media. And I think we actually have a clip of that at a panel in 2013 on C-SPAN, which, Kelly, I believe you were a part of. So let's take a look at what Kevin Cullen had to say about Boston Marathon bombing related matters in that 2013 panel.
Deputy Fire Chief Joe Fenn, a great fireman, grabbed me. He said, he had his iPhone. He was like this. He goes, this is Sean O'Brien. He goes, I can't get him out of the house. And he goes, talk to him. I go, what did he talk? I go, hey, Sean, it's Kevin. Yeah, I know. Why don't you come on out? Come down and have a drink with me and Joe. And I don't even know what I'm talking to him about. He goes, no, I don't want to come out. I don't want to come out. And I go, okay, well, listen, I'll see you later. And I said to Joe, I said, was Sean at the scene? And he said, he goes, Sean found the kid. And that's when I found out that the boy had died.
And that was determined by an investigation, I think 2 investigations conducted by the Globe, to have been fabricated. I want to ask another question about possible mitigating factors here. It was not my sense in reading the piece that Kevin Cullen inserted himself into the story the way we saw him insert himself into that apparently bogus anecdote about the Boston Marathon bombings. I actually thought the story was very compelling, both his reporting and the photos, which were, I thought, remarkably moving, taken by Jessica Rinaldi. We got to see Lynda Bluestein in a whole bunch of different situations as she headed toward ending her life. I found the combination of the photos and the reporting to be very evocative. For me, I had the same reaction that both of you had when I first learned this had happened. I thought to myself, no, you just can't do that. He became part of the story. He changed the outcome of the story or changed the way it unfolded. But then I found myself thinking, those of us in the media, when we cover a story like this, we are accustomed to individuals opening up access to an incredibly sensitive and fraught and difficult period in their lives. It's an ask that we tend to make of members of the public. And as a rule, our coverage is something that we give them in return, but we don't give them much back. We get access at a time when people are very vulnerable. I found myself thinking, is it really that big a deal that Kevin Cullen chose to attest to the sound, mental state of a woman who had taken him and his photographer into her life with this depth and with this level of richness? Is there any case to be made for this as a sort of the returning of a favor that was done to Cullen and his photographer by Lynda Bluestein?
You know, I think the returning of the favor is a well-told story, a story told with dignity and with compassion. And I agree, he did do that. It is a really well-told story. But I don't think that, I think it actually became a distraction. I think if he thought it was a favor to her, he didn't do her any favors because we're talking about this rather
That's
than
a very good
the rest
point.
of the story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also my point of view. I sort of feel like I hear what you're saying. We do ask a lot of people. But in this case, this was a woman who had chosen to do a lot of advocacy around this issue. She wanted to open up her home and tell her story in an effort to help people, right? And in this case, the thing that you're doing for this woman is telling her story. And to me, that's the argument for publishing the story, despite the fact that he made this mistake, right? I think they sort of owed it to this woman to tell her story after having taken up so much of her time and having, essentially taken advantage of her generosity in this case. So I do think the Globe made the right decision to publish because of that, but I don't think it was the right decision to sign this paperwork. It just feels like it wasn't necessary. And yes, it's been such a distraction that it's taken away from this very moving piece. I agree. It's really a good piece of journalism.
The paper, as I understand it, and Kelly, I can't remember if you mentioned this earlier, I believe they learned about what we've been discussing here after Lynda Bluestein had died and after the story had been filed. Susie, you just said you think publishing was the right call despite this wrinkle. Kelly, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. But I think it's telling that he didn't tell any of his editors back in July when he signed it, and that it was as they were getting the story ready to go into production that they realized that there was this complication that needed to be explained with an editor's note.
All right, final question for both of you, and we'll go Kelly and Susie and leave it there. Should there be some sort of sanctioning, do you think, of Kevin Cullen for the way this played out and the step that he took?
I mean, that's up to the newsroom. We don't know that there hasn't been, right? We haven't heard of anything publicly, but we don't know that there hasn't been. And I really think that is between him and Nancy Barnes, the editor of the Globe.
Susie, you got the last word.
Yeah, I agree. It's not really for us to say. Obviously, we're not in the newsroom, but I will say this, that if you have a reporter who's had ethical breaches in the past and you publicly state that this is an ethical breach, you are in danger of setting a standard in your newsroom that there are different rules for different people. Because, one assumes that any other reporter who had 2 ethical breaches would have some consequence for that, especially at the second time. So my instinct as an outsider, which is like, I'm here to give my opinion, is that there probably should be some consequence to this to make a point to the newsroom that this isn't acceptable. And when you do things that aren't acceptable, there are, results. But in the end, I've led a lot of newsrooms, and you make decisions and you don't always make them public. And so I'm going to give Nancy Barnes grace here because that's what I would want.
And to that point, we did ask the paper if there was going to be some sort of sanctioning, and they said they do not comment on personal matters. Susie Banikarim, Kelly McBride, thank you both for talking this thorny issue through.